Is the United States still a democracy? Or has it become a plutocracy run by the very rich? In the next 10 minutes, we'll define terms, look at the evidence, and explain what it means for everyday Americans. First, let's get our definitions straight. At the heart of the American experiment is the ideal of democracy. The word itself means political rule by the people. But what does that truly entail? It rests on three core pillars. First, broad participation. This means every citizen has the right and the opportunity to engage in the political process, not just by voting, but by speaking out, assembling, and even running for office. Second, equal influence. This is the principle of one person, one vote, the radical idea that a factory worker's political voice should carry the same weight as a billionaire's. It's about political equality, regardless of economic standing. And third, accountability. In a democracy, leaders serve at the pleasure of the people. If they fail to represent their constituents' interests, they can be held accountable at the ballot box. This is the system of checks and balances that ensures government remains, as Lincoln famously said, of the people, by the people, for the people. On the other end of the spectrum is plutocracy. Derived from the Greek words plautos, meaning wealth, and kratos, meaning rule, it literally means rule by the wealthy. This isn't necessarily a system where only rich people can vote or hold office. Instead, it's a system where political power is so intertwined with economic power that the interests of the wealthy class consistently override the interests of the general population. How does this happen? Through several key mechanisms. Wealthy individuals and corporations can make enormous campaign contributions, creating a sense of obligation from politicians. They can fund powerful lobbying efforts to shape legislation in their favor, often behind closed doors. They can finance think tanks and media campaigns to influence public opinion. And through the revolving door, former government officials take high-paying jobs in the industries they once regulated, and vice versa. In a plutocracy, the principle of one person, one vote is effectively replaced by $1, one vote. So, is the United States a democracy or a plutocracy? The reality is that no modern nation is purely one or the other. Most real-world political systems are a mixture, existing on a spectrum between these two poles. The United States certainly has the foundational architecture of a democracy, a constitution, regular elections, and protected freedoms of speech and assembly. We see its spirit in action during every election, in every town hall, and at every peaceful protest. However, it also has features that concentrate political influence in the hands of the wealthy, raising legitimate concerns about a plutocratic drift. The critical question isn't whether the US is a perfect democracy. None is. The question we must ask is, which way is the scale tipping? Is the immense power of private wealth beginning to erode the democratic principle of political equality? Is the voice of the average citizen being drowned out by the megaphone of money? That is the central question we will explore. To judge this, we look at measurable things. Who shapes policy, campaign finance and lobbying, voting access, representation, court and institutional power, and outcomes? Whose preferences become law? So, how can we scientifically measure political influence? It's a complex question, but political scientists have developed powerful methods to find an answer. Instead of just looking at who holds office, they analyze whose preferences actually become law. One of the most influential studies on this topic was conducted by Martin Gilens of Princeton University and Benjamin Page of Northwestern University. They created a massive data set analyzing nearly 1,800 different policy proposals in the United States between 1981 and 2002. For each proposal, they determined two key things. First, how much support it had among average citizens, and second, how much support it had among economic elites defined as the top 10% of income earners and organized business interest groups. Then they checked to see which of these proposed policies actually became law. The results were stark and have been debated ever since. The study found that the preferences of the average American have a minimal, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy. In other words, whether a policy was supported by 20% of the public or 80% of the public made virtually no difference to its chances of being enacted. However, the preferences of economic elites and organized business groups were a completely different story. When they supported a policy, it was significantly more likely to become law. When they opposed it, it was almost certain to fail, regardless of how much support it had from the general public. This data suggests a dramatic divergence between the will of the people and the outcomes of government. So why does this happen? The research points to a few key mechanisms. First, there's the immense power of lobbying. Organized interest groups, overwhelmingly representing business and corporate interests, spend billions of dollars every year to influence lawmakers in Washington. They employ armies of professional lobbyists whose full-time job is to build relationships and advocate for their clients' specific policy goals, often drafting the very legislation they want to see passed. Second is the role of money in politics, particularly campaign finance. While direct bribery is illegal, the need to raise vast sums of money for re-election campaigns can make politicians highly attentive to the policy preferences of their wealthiest donors and the super PACs that can make or break a campaign. This creates a system where access and influence are often tied to the ability to write large checks. Finally, there's the phenomenon known as the revolving door. This is the constant flow of individuals between jobs in government and high-paying positions in the private sector as lobbyists or consultants. This creates a culture where regulators and lawmakers may be hesitant to take strong action against industries they might one day hope to work for. Now, it's crucial to understand that this doesn't mean elites and business groups always get their way on every single issue. They don't. When the preferences of the wealthy and the general public happen to align, policy changes are very likely to be adopted. The problem arises when their interests diverge. In those cases of conflict, the evidence suggests that the wealthy overwhelmingly win. This model is sometimes called biased pluralism, the idea that while our democracy is a contest of competing groups, the field is heavily tilted in favor of those with the most economic resources. Campaign finance matters. Court rulings and legal changes increased independent spending and outside groups. Big donors, PACs and dark money organizations amplify wealthy voices and fund elections, advertising and think tanks. Beyond direct campaign contributions, two of the most powerful tools for translating wealth into political influence are lobbying and the revolving door. While the right to petition the government is protected by the First Amendment, modern lobbying has evolved into a multi-billion-dollar industry. In recent years, spending on federal lobbying has consistently exceeded $3.5 billion annually. Employing over 12,000 registered lobbyists in Washington, D.C., that's more than 20 lobbyists for every single member of Congress. This immense financial firepower creates a constant presence and pressure on Capitol Hill that public interest groups and average citizens simply cannot match. So how does this money translate into influence? It's often more subtle than a direct quid pro quo. Lobbying is about access and information control. Wealthy corporations and industry groups can afford to hire teams of experts who are available 24/7 to provide lawmakers and their staff with detailed data, analysis, and even pre-written legislative text. While this information can be useful, it's always presented through a lens that benefits the lobbyist client. More importantly, the money ensures that when a crucial decision is being made, their calls get answered. Their representatives get a seat at the table to shape the details of a bill, while the voices of ordinary constituents might struggle to even get a meeting. This brings us to the revolving door, the seamless transition of individuals between jobs as government officials and roles as lobbyists or consultants for the very industries they were tasked with regulating. A former member of Congress, a high-level agency official, or a senior congressional staffer leaves their public service role and after a brief waiting period takes a high-paying position on K Street, the hub of Washington's lobbying world. They are hired not just for their expertise, but for their invaluable personal connections and insider knowledge of the legislative and regulatory process. This practice creates a deeply problematic set of incentives. A regulator overseeing the financial industry might be less inclined to enforce strict rules against a big bank if they know a seven-figure salary could be waiting for them at that same bank or a related industry group once they leave government. It creates a potential, often unspoken, conflict of interest. These former officials then use their privileged access, their ability to call up their old colleagues and friends still in government, to advocate for their new corporate employers. This gives their clients an enormous, almost insurmountable advantage in the policy-making process. The numbers are staggering. According to watchdog groups like Open Secrets, in recent years, over half of all retiring or defeated members of Congress have gone on to work in lobbying or related influence industries. This isn't an anomaly, it's a well-trodden and highly lucrative career path. The effect is a government culture where public service can be seen as a stepping stone to private wealth, potentially compromising the impartiality of our lawmakers and regulators while they are still in office. Ultimately, lobbying and the revolving door create a powerful feedback loop that is central to the argument that the US is leaning towards plutocracy. Wealth is used to hire lobbyists and former officials. This purchased influence is then used to shape laws and regulations, tax codes, environmental rules, financial oversight, in ways that benefit large corporations and the wealthy. These favorable policies, in turn, allow them to accumulate even more wealth, which can then be reinvested into more lobbying and political influence. It's a self-perpetuating cycle where economic power and political power become fused, systematically prioritizing the interests of the few over the needs of the many. Structural features also matter. The Senate gives small states more power, gerrymandering and voter barriers reduce some communities' influence, and courts sometimes protect elite-friendly rules. These institutional quirks shift power away from simply one-person, one-vote equality. But it's not total. Competitive elections still produce big changes. Social movements, local democracy, journalism, and legal reforms have pushed back. Ordinary voters sometimes win policy gains when mobilized. Look at outcomes. Tax policy, regulation, bailouts, and health or labor policy. These show where power translates into material effects. Often elites shape rules to preserve wealth, but outcomes vary by era and politics. So, is the US a plutocracy? Short answer, not purely. But diagnostics show overall pronounced plutocratic tendencies. Wealth and organized elites have outsized influence across institutions and policy. Democracy still exists, but is imperfect and hotly contested. Why it matters? Concentrated influence can make government less responsive to ordinary needs. That affects living costs, opportunity, and trust. But citizens have tools. Voting, local organizing, supporting transparency reforms, public financing of campaigns, and civic participation. If you care, start local. Register and vote, support transparency and campaign finance reform groups, follow investigative journalism, and get involved in community organizations. Sources and further reading are in the description.